Barrett Sallee, welcome into the game here in T-Town. I hope all is well, man.
I'm great, Ryan. How are you?
Good. I'm just laughing at the music that we were bringing you back with. Just trying to make sure that you feel at home with Super Bowl.
I appreciate that. I wish we'd have heard more of that particular artist last night, but alas, we get Maroon 5, which has nothing to do with football or Atlanta, but whatever. I'm not making the decision.
All right, so how would you grade your hometown of rolling out the red carpet for the Super Bowl? What grade would you give them?
A+. I
Okay.
mean, except for that monstrosity of a halftime show. But that's really the NFL. That's not.
Sure. Right.
But honestly, I'm not saying this because I live here, and I think part of it also is the fact that it came 1 year after Minneapolis. But everybody that I've talked to in this business said, even Trey Wingo, today said it needs to happen here way more often than it does. I think a lot of that has to do. I mean, Alabama fans know this. Because they've sort of seen this whole thing happen with the kickoff game. The city and the surrounding area has changed so much over the last really 10 years, but even dating back to the Olympics. And when you have everything so concentrated right there with so many entertainment options, it's so easy for everything to happen. So I'd say we did a great job. I think that they worked really hard at it, and I think also part of the success, so to speak, is because it is coming off of the Minneapolis thing, which is a debacle. But it'll be here, no doubt about that.
Barrett, when you look at Alabama, we were discussing a couple of minutes ago. 4 weeks later, it's not easier for Alabama fans, and even when you look back at 4 weeks ago, what happened to Alabama. Nick Saban's probably worst game of his career. I mean, he got punched in the mouth. Alabama fans are still having a hard time with it. Should they be? Is this a sign for more to come, or is this a sign that you got to repair some holes? And maybe that's what Nick Saban is doing, even though nothing officially has came down about all these assistant coaches here in T-Town.
Well, not to dodge the question, I think it's both. I mean, blip on the radar, sure, but reason to be concerned, yeah. I mean, because you're not going to win every national championship, and I think the idea that for Alabama or any fan, even New England Patriots fans, that you're going to win every championship, that's not going to happen. It's just flat out not going to happen. So, I think if that's the indication, I'd say that's more user error, for lack of a better term, than anything else, because that's just unrealistic. And you're going to have to deal with Clemson, and Clemson's going to be there, I would say, just as much as Alabama. So do you have to figure out a way to beat them? No, I think Alabama can do what it typically does and, have a really good shot at beating them. But so Clemson's going to do what it does and has a really good shot at beating Alabama every year. So I don't necessarily think it's reason for concern or, a retooling. I just think that, the expectations, I say this every time Alabama wins a national championship for every offseason, like, guys, Alabama's not invincible. Alabama loses games. Alabama's not perfect. These are still 18 to 22-year-old kids. Some of them are not going to get it. Some of them are going to do dumb things on the field. Some of them are going to do dumb things off the field. It's the expectation of winning a national championship every year is, I think, incredibly unrealistic. And look, I mean, even Terry Saban, what was that, 4 or 5 years ago when the whole Texas thing sort of happened? She insinuated that it's the expectation level's a little high. Look, I understand you want to win a national championship every year. I mean, everybody does. But that's just flat out not going to happen no matter who you are.
All right, biggest concern that stands between Alabama doing it again next year and in this current team, what is the biggest thing that stands in the way of Alabama making it to New Orleans and hoisting up the championship trophy?
Trevor Lawrence. I mean, Trevor Lawrence is the biggest thing because now Clemson has a guy, as opposed to 2 years ago when Alabama beat him in New Orleans. They have a guy now who can take over a game, just like Tua Tagovailoa, and that with success, just like Tua Tagovailoa had. And I'd even say more success in the sense that he's the one who took over as a true freshman and actually led them to a title throughout the season than Tua did, which I think is it's a distinction with a little bit of a difference, if that makes sense. Alabama, and your defense clearly had issues against Trevor Lawrence in the past, you can make some adjustments, but you ain't going to stop him all the time. So getting to that point and playing Clemson again, I think is going to happen a lot. But Alabama at its best and Clemson at its best, there is no difference right now. And I think that's the biggest thing standing in the way is that, in the past, Alabama's played some good teams that have played their best games, but they need that to win. Alabama needs to not play a day game, for them to fall to Auburn in the kick six or whatever. Now, if Clemson plays its best and Alabama plays its best, it ain't a sure thing that Alabama's going to win. In fact, I think it's about 50-50 at that point.
And maybe that's what scares Alabama is there's now a new it hurts to say this, but there's a new dog up front.
Yeah, there is. And that's, there's always been talk about the dynasty, right? Like every time Alabama loses or wins, it's all about the dynasty. And it's like, look, Alabama ruled college football even when it wasn't winning national championships before. I mean, it ruled college football. Is Alabama ruling college football right now?
Wednesday, it might be a confirmation because he's still winning there, which is if he loses 70% of his coaches, which he's done, and still pulls off the number one recruiting class, how frustrating is that? So in some ways, yeah, they're still doing what they've been doing, but in other ways, not so much.
Yeah, exactly. You can't say that Clemson's not ruling. Everything you said about Alabama, go say it about Clemson. You can say that too. Recruiting its tail off, producing success at an elite level. And that's why it's like, look, but you have to have, in order to be called a dynasty, you have to be ruling something. And you can't say that Alabama's ruling college football over Clemson right now. You can say they're battling for power and trading power, but that's not a dynasty. That's superpowers. Trading blows. That's all that is.
Barrett, but on the field, not Trevor Lawrence, because I think it's a great answer. It is a big concern. But what can Nick Saban do? Because I look back at Dabo. he made the move from Kelly Bryant to Trevor Lawrence to get ready for Alabama. What can Nick Saban do now to get ready for Clemson?
I think that the biggest thing is figure out a way to have a secondary that can that is not going to be exploited if the pass rush doesn't work. I think Clemson beat Alabama because its offensive line had the best game it's had. And that offensive line was pretty good anyway, but Clemson's offensive line played its best game against its toughest opponent. And as a result, Trevor Lawrence, had a field day, so to speak. They need to find a way in the secondary to still play elite level football, elite level defense when they're not getting the benefit of a Quinnen Williams. Because how many times did you mention Quinnen Williams during that Clemson game? Because I didn't really mention him all that much, right? So I think that's the biggest thing is, Alabama, I think that defensive front masked a lot of problems in the secondary this past season. So they've got to find a way to get some guys back there who can get it done even when things aren't perfect. And, that I think is, goes back to something that maybe, was a curse rather than a blessing this year. We always talked about, or last year, everyone talked about how much Alabama was blowing teams out. And yeah, that was impressive, but pretty much everything was perfect for Alabama. Well, everything's not going to be perfect all the time. And when it wasn't in the worst possible time, Alabama couldn't handle it. So you need to be tested, and not to say that they need to lose some games, but if you're an Alabama fan, you kind of do want to see those times where you're kind of getting pushed by a team that is pretty darn talented to see what your guys are made of before the national championship and before the playoff, because I think that ended up being one of the hidden curses of that team rather than one of the ways to compliment.
But all these Alabama teams, we saw Hightower do it last night, Rolando McClain back in 2009. You go to all these championship seasons, they generally had a alpha dog on the defensive side of the football, especially at linebacker. They had a defensive lineman by the name of Quinnen Williams, but when you talk about linebacker play, they didn't get good linebacker play out of the middles. Now, they got some out of the outside backers.
Yeah.
But when we talk about Dylan Moses and Mack Wilson, those guys had a quiet 2018.
Yeah, they did. Definitely not what people were expecting. I wonder if Terrell Lewis's absence had something to do with,
Sure.
the lack of an alpha dog back there. But no, that's a problem. There are quiet guys that do it. There are, vocal guys. You mentioned Dante Hightower and what he did. Dante wasn't the most vocal guy in the world. He got the job done. C.J. Mosley was great. Those guys, you need a guy like that. I don't necessarily know if it's something you can teach, and I don't necessarily know if it's something that just has to be taught, or maybe the absence of a leader like Terrell Lewis or whatever, really prevented somebody from stepping up to be that guy to understand what, whose place it was supposed to be. I don't know, but it certainly is a problem. And it's not something that is, impossible to fix. In fact, I think it's rather easy to fix, especially if you can yell at these players for an entire offseason about it like Nick Saban can now. But that was a legit problem for Alabama. There's no doubt.
But I also think when you back up just a couple of minutes, we talk about National Signing Day. If you ever thought Nick Saban, and I know the early signing period helped him out. He got a lot of those guys locked up, got a lot of the I's dotted and the T's crossed. But if he can hold together this number one signing class and lose 70% of his assistant coaches, back up just for a minute. It's pretty remarkable.
It is. It's really remarkable, and I think it speaks to the machine that is Alabama. Because, I think coaching turnover. If you're going to sign with Alabama, you're going to have to understand that those coaches are going to leave. Even a couple days after you sign or a year after you sign, you understand that. So, I think that's more Alabama brand selling itself and trust in Nick Saban more than anything else. That's a huge compliment to Nick Saban. It's a huge compliment to the assistant coaches that were on staff and the assistant coaches before them to continue to go through processes like that and still elite level teams. So, it's an interesting time for Nick Saban because, like you said, a lot of those moves haven't been announced, but obviously those hires have been made. And if they can keep that together, and obviously there's not a whole lot to keep together because most of the ink's already dry, but it'd be big for Alabama to make that statement. But then you look at the other side and say, okay, well, Georgia, Texas A&M is doing the same thing. Things might get pretty interesting in the SEC. Obviously, Georgia's a player right now, and Alabama knows that. But if Jimbo keeps doing what he's doing at Texas A&M, then that could be a problem too.
Well, and I wonder what Alabama's waiting on, like as far as press releases. What exactly is taking so long? Sark's been here for a month, and we have no press release. I don't know if maybe it was NFL contractual obligations. A lot of times those guys have to get. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe it's something to do with compensation. Getting past the Super Bowl, as we know that, this week's going to be very busy for transactions in the NFL. I don't know if that had something to do with it. Still no or defensive coordinator, exactly how that's going to work. There's a lot of questions in Tuscaloosa. Certainly, hopefully, this is the week that we'll find out answers. You guys will have tons of coverage. CBSSports.com, Barrett Sallee, SiriusXM, Channel 84. Barrett, as always, I appreciate your conversation, man. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.